The sky over the city didn't just leak. It mourned in a relentless, great deluge that turned the gutters into rushing rivers. In the center of the chaos stood 3-year-old Amara, her small boots submerged in freezing mud, her tiny frame shaking with a sob that tore through the sound of the falling rain. "Mummy! Mummy, don't leave us!" she screamed, her mouth open in a jagged line of pure, infant desperation. Her small hands reached forward, grasping at nothing but the humid, heavy air as she tried to bridge the gap between her world and the closing door of the sleek black sedan. Alessandro DeLuca was on his knees beside her, a man stripped of his pride and his power in a single afternoon. His fingers clutched at the cold metal of the car's handle, his face a mask of panic and disbelief as the rain washed the salt of his tears into the grime on his cheeks. "Isabella, please. Look at her," he choked out, his voice cracking against the roar of the storm. "You can't do this. We're a family. You can't just walk away because things got hard." Inside the car, shielded by tinted glass and climate control, Isabella Vaughn didn't even flinch. She sat with a spine of ice, her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the broken man or the child she had carried for 9 months. Beside her sat Sebastian Vaughn, his hand resting possessively over hers, a smirk of triumph playing on his lips as he watched his rival's total annihilation. "I'm not walking away from family, Alessandro." Isabella's voice drifted out as the window cracked open just an inch, cold and biting. "I'm walking away from a ghost. I'm tired of waiting for a man who doesn't know how to win." With a soft thud, the door locked. The engine roared to life, spraying muddy water over Alessandro's worn coat as the car pulled away. Amara collapsed into the slush, her cries weakening into rhythmic, heartbroken gasps, while Alessandro watched the red taillights vanish into the fog, the final embers of the life he once knew. The neon lights of the city flickered like dying stars, casting long, oily shadows over the alleyway where Alessandro sheltered his daughter from the biting wind. It had been days since the rain had stopped, but the dampness had settled into their bones, a permanent reminder of a life that had washed away. Amara clutched a threadbare blanket, her eyes wide and hollow, no longer screaming, but occasionally letting out a soft, rhythmic whimper that cut deeper than any blade. Alessandro reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against nothing but lint and the jagged edges of a pride he could no longer afford. He had exactly 75 cents, not even enough for a bus ride, let alone a miracle. They stood outside a small, independent bakery, the scent of yeast and warm sugar mocking their empty stomachs. Alessandro watched through the glass as a woman with deep, soulful eyes and a graceful strength in her posture, Simone Carter, carefully arranged a tray of golden loaves. She caught sight of them, a broken man in a tattered coat and a little girl whose face was a mask of quiet starvation. Alessandro looked away, his face burning with a shame that felt heavier than the hunger, but he couldn't move his feet. Simone stepped out into the cold, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful irony. She didn't look at them with the pity that stung or the disgust that Alessandro had grown used to from the city's elite. Instead, she held out a brown paper bag, the heat from the fresh bread radiating through the paper. "It's a bit overbaked," she said softly, her voice like a steady hand in a storm. "I was going to toss it, but it seems a waste." Alessandro knew the bread wasn't overbaked. He saw the perfection of the crust, the steam rising in the night air. He looked at Simone, seeing a kindness that didn't demand an explanation or a repayment he couldn't give. As Amara reached out, her small fingers trembling as they closed around the warm bag, Alessandro felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt since the rain, a reason to keep his eyes open until tomorrow. He took a piece of the warm, soft bread, the simple act of eating feeling like a silent vow to the woman who had looked at him and seen a human being instead of a ghost. The morning air was a sharp, biting blade that cut through Alessandro's thin coat, yet he stood tall, shielding Amara from the brunt of the wind as they walked the gray pavement. The warmth of the bread from the night before was a fading memory, replaced by the cold reality of a world that demanded a price for every breath. As they passed a weathered newsstand, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a vibrant, patterned shawl stepped into their path. Lucia Moreno looked at Alessandro not with the pity of a stranger, but with the startling clarity of a woman who remembered a different version of the man standing before her. "Mr. DeLuca," she said, her voice raspy but firm, catching him before he could duck his head in shame. "I have been looking for you since the rain started. You have a habit of disappearing when the world gets loud." Alessandro paused, his hand tightening instinctively on Amara's shoulder. He barely remembered the night years ago when he had found Lucia shivering outside a clinic and handed her the last of his cash for her heart medication, telling her to keep it as a gift. "Lucia, I'm not in a position to talk about the past," Alessandro replied, his voice low and weary. "I don't have anything left to give." "I'm not here to take, Alessandro," Lucia countered, reaching into the pocket of her apron. "I'm here to settle. You gave me life when I had none. I've carried this debt like a stone in my shoe." She pressed a small, rectangular slip of paper into his palm, a lottery ticket, its edges crisp and clean. "The jackpot is tonight. It's 100 million, they say. I bought it with the first bit of extra change I've had in months, and I bought it for you." Alessandro looked down at the ticket, a bitter smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. $100 million felt like a fairy tale told to a dying man. "Lucia, I don't believe in luck anymore." Luck drove away in a black sedan. "Then don't believe in luck," Lucia said, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "Believe in justice. Sometimes the universe waits for a man to lose everything just to see what he does when he finally wins." She squeezed his hand, her touch surprisingly warm, before disappearing back into the crowd of commuters, leaving Alessandro standing in the cold with a thin piece of paper that felt suddenly, inexplicably heavy. The flickering static of a communal television in the corner of the crowded shelter hummed like a swarm of angry hornets. Alessandro sat on the edge of a plastic chair, his body shielding Amara from the desperate coughs and low murmurs of the room. In his hand, the lottery ticket Lucia had pressed into his palm felt like a lead weight, warm from the heat of his skin. He hadn't intended to check it. Hope was a luxury that usually ended in a sharper sting of disappointment. But as the nightly news anchor began reading the winning numbers, a strange, electric silence settled over his mind. One by one, the digits appeared on the screen, a sequence that felt like a code being punched into a vault. Alessandro looked down at the crumpled paper, then back at the glowing numbers. His heart didn't race, it stopped. The ticket in his hand was a perfect match for the $100 million jackpot. A suffocating wave of adrenaline crashed over him, a roar in his ears that drowned out the crying of babies and the smell of damp wool. He was no longer a beggar. He was the wealthiest man in the room, perhaps the city. But as he moved to stand, the image of Isabella's cold, triumphant smile flashed in his mind. He froze. He remembered the legal fine print of their unfinished life together. They were separated, but in the eyes of the law, they were still bound. If he claimed this prize now, while the ink on their marriage license was still wet, the law would see this windfall as communal property. Isabella, the woman who had left him and their daughter to rot in the mud, would be entitled to $50 million of his redemption. The realization turned his victory into a cage. She had already taken his car, his home, and his dignity. He would not let her take the future he finally held for Amara. He tucked the ticket deep into the hidden lining of his coat, his eyes hardening with a new, predatory focus. He couldn't go to the lottery office. He couldn't tell a soul. Before he could become a millionaire, he had to become a ghost, navigating a legal minefield to cut the tether to Isabella once and for all. The game had changed. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was at war. The office of Charles Whitmore was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and the scent of old parchment, a world away from the damp, gray reality of the streets where Alessandro had spent his recent nights. Charles sat behind a desk that looked like a fortress, his eyes sharp and analytical as he studied the man before him. He didn't see a beggar. He saw a client with a secret that could tilt the axis of the city. Alessandro sat rigidly, Amara asleep in a leather chair beside him, her small hand still tucked into the hidden lining of his coat, where the ticket lay like a live wire. You are in a precarious position, Alessandro, Charles began, his voice a low, rhythmic hum of authority. The law is a mirror. It reflects the status of your life the moment you claim that prize. If you walk into that lottery office today, Isabella is legally entitled to half of every cent. In her eyes, and the eyes of the court, you are still a single economic unit. Alessandro's jaw tightened. She left us in the rain, Charles. She chose a different unit. The law doesn't care about rain. It cares about signatures, Charles countered, leaning forward. To protect this, we need a clean break strategy. We cannot let her smell the money. If she suspects you have a dime, she will stall the divorce for years, bleeding you dry in litigation. Charles tapped a silver pen against a stack of papers. We must bait the trap. We offer her a final, mutual release settlement. We give her the remaining assets you still technically hold, the deed to that small, debt-ridden family property and the car she already stole. We make it look like a surrender, a desperate man giving up his last scraps just to be free of the shadow of a woman he can no longer afford to love. She'll think she's won, Alessandro murmured, a cold, predatory light finally sparking in his eyes. Exactly, Charles replied with a thin, sharp smile. She will sign the papers to humiliate you, thinking she has taken your last crumb. And the moment that judge's gavel hits the wood, the tether is cut. Only then do you become a millionaire. Until that second, you must remain the man she thinks you are, a failure with nothing left to lose. The fluorescent lights of the sterile mediation room hummed with a cold, clinical indifference that matched the expression on Isabella's face. She sat across from Alessandro, flanked by Sebastian, who looked at the cramped office with the disdain of a man who owned the horizon. Alessandro played his part to perfection, keeping his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, his hand trembling slightly as he held a cheap plastic pen. To them, he was a defeated animal offering up his last scraps of flesh to stop the hunt. I can't believe we had to drive all the way down here for this pittance, Sebastian sneered, leaning back and checking his gold watch. The deed to a crumbling shack and a car that's already in my garage? You really are a pathetic excuse for a provider, Alessandro. Isabella slid the clean break agreement toward him with the tip of her manicured finger, as if touching anything he owned might stain her. Just sign it, Alessandro. I want every legal tie to you severed before the sun sets. I'm tired of being associated with your failures. Alessandro looked up, his eyes watery and desperate, the ultimate mask of a man who had lost everything. If I sign this, if I give you the house and the car, you'll leave Amara and me alone? No more lawyers? No more claims? Claims on what? Your debt. Isabella laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in the small room. Sign the paper. I'm waiving my right to anything you ever touch again, mostly because I know you'll never touch anything worth having. With a heavy, feigned sigh, Alessandro pressed the pen to the paper. He signed his name with a slow, deliberate stroke, handing over the worthless assets that were the bait in his trap. As Isabella and Sebastian stood up, tucking the signed release into a designer briefcase with triumphant smirks, they didn't see the predatory stillness that took over Alessandro's frame the moment the door clicked shut. He wasn't a beggar anymore. The tether was cut, the judge's signature was pending, and for the first time in 7 years, he was a free man holding a $100 million secret. The ink on the divorce decree was barely dry before the ghost of Alessandro DeLuca vanished, replaced by a predator moving through the city's glass and steel canyons. For the next 7 years, Alessandro operated in the cold, calculated shadows, fueled by the $100 million secret he had protected with his own blood and dignity. He didn't just spend the money, he weaponized it. He acquired distressed tech firms, bought up the debt of rival developers, and built a conglomerate that moved like a leviathan beneath the surface of the local economy. Every move was a silent strike. Every acquisition a brick in a fortress designed to protect the laughter of a growing Amara, who now moved through sunlit gardens instead of rain-slicked alleys. While Alessandro's shadow lengthened over the city, the empire Sebastian Vaughn had built on arrogance began to crack. Sebastian, blinded by his own reflection and Isabella's constant demands for a life of escalating excess, failed to see the rot in his foundations. The worthless family property Alessandro had surrendered was just the first domino. The taxes and hidden liabilities attached to it acted like a slow-acting poison in Sebastian's portfolio. Contracts that had been guaranteed for decades suddenly evaporated, redirected to a mysterious new parent company that seemed to know Sebastian's every weakness. Isabella watched as the gold leaf began to peel from her life. The luxury galas grew quieter, and the black sedans were replaced by repossession notices. She sat in her darkening mansion, unaware that the beggar she had left in the mud was the very architect of her ruin. Alessandro didn't need to see her face to know the fear taking root in her heart. He felt it in the market shifts and the plummeting stocks. He was no longer the man reaching for a closing car door. He was the one who owned the road, the car, and the very air the Vaughns breathed, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows and reclaim the light. The heavy glass doors of the city's most exclusive gala swung open, but it wasn't the sound of the hinges that drew the room's attention. It was the sudden, suffocating silence that followed the man who entered. Alessandro DeLuca walked with a predator's grace, no longer the broken shadow who had once begged for bread in the rain. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light of the crystal chandeliers, his face a mask of iron-willed confidence that radiated pure, unchecked power. Beside him, Simone Carter stood with an elegance that matched his own, her hand resting on the arm of the man the tabloids had spent months calling the Phantom Mogul, the mysterious force that had systematically dismantled the city's oldest dynasties. Every eye in the room tracked his movement, but Alessandro's gaze was fixed on a single point, the corner where Sebastian and Isabella Vaughn stood, clutching champagne flutes like lifelines. As he approached, the crowd parted like a dark sea. Sebastian's face drained of color, his glass trembling as he recognized the features of the man he had once mocked as a pathetic failure. The worthless beggar from the mud had returned, not as a ghost, but as the king of the very empire the Vaughns were about to lose. "Good evening, Sebastian," Alessandro said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried the weight of 7 years of silent planning. "I believe you're holding a seat at my table." Isabella's breath hitched, her eyes darting from Alessandro's polished shoes to the glowing lottery-funded empire reflected in his diamond cufflinks. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The man she had discarded was now the most powerful man in the city, the MAFIA boss of industry who held her entire future in his hands. Alessandro didn't offer a smile of revenge. He offered a look of absolute indifference. He had already won. He moved past them without a backward glance, leaving the Vaughns standing in the chilling realization that the rain they had left him in had finally come back to drown them. The mahogany-paneled boardroom of Vaughn International felt like a tomb, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and cheap desperation. Sebastian sat at the head of the table, his hands trembling as he stared at the foreclosure notice that had arrived like a guillotine blade. Across from him, Isabella gripped her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting a miracle. They had spent 7 years building a monument to their own vanity, only to realize the foundation was made of Alessandro's debt and their own greed. The double doors swung open, and Alessandro DeLuca stepped inside, followed by Charles Whitmore and a phalanx of legal assistants. He didn't look like a man seeking revenge. He looked like a man concluding a simple, inevitable transaction. He tossed a thick folder onto the table, the final acquisition papers for the parent company that now owned every one of Sebastian's liabilities. "The bank has accepted my offer, Sebastian," Alessandro said, his voice calm and terrifyingly cold. "As of 10 minutes ago, Vaughn International no longer exists. It is now a subsidiary of DeLuca Holdings." Sebastian's face twisted into a mask of impotent rage. "You used that worthless property to poison my portfolio? You planned this from the day you signed those papers." "I didn't plan your failure, Sebastian. I simply invested in it," Alessandro replied, leaning forward until he could see his own reflection in the gold watch Sebastian was still wearing, a watch that now legally belonged to Alessandro. You and Isabella thought you were winning because you took my last crumb. You forgot that a man with nothing is the most dangerous man to bet against. Isabella stood up, her voice a shrill, desperate plea. Alessandro, we can talk about this. For the sake of our history. Our history ended in the rain. Isabella. Alessandro cut her off, his gaze shifting to the window where the city he now owned stretched out beneath him. Security is waiting downstairs to escort you out. You have 30 minutes to clear your desks. Leave the keys to the cars on the table. They were part of the buyout. He turned his back on them. The silence of the room, punctuated only by the sound of the world he had built rising to meet him. The glass and steel lobby of the DeLuca Tower felt like a cathedral of cold, hard-won justice as Alessandro stepped toward the exit, his shadow long and commanding across the marble floor. Before he could reach the revolving doors, a frantic figure stumbled into his path. Isabella looked like a ghost of her former self, her designer coat wrinkled and her eyes bloodshot, stripped of the arrogance that had once been her only shield. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she tried to touch the sleeve of the man who now moved in a different orbit. Alessandro, please, she sobbed, the sound echoing hollowly against the high ceilings. I made a mistake. Sebastian was a monster. He manipulated me. I never stopped thinking about you. About us. Please, for the sake of Amara, give me a second chance. We could be a family again. Alessandro stopped, but he didn't turn. He looked down at the hand on his arm with the same detached curiosity one might show an insect. At that moment, the doors opened, and 10-year-old Amara walked in, her face bright with a radiant, carefree smile that had never been touched by the mud of her past. She was flanked by Simone, who held the girl's hand with a quiet, protective grace. Amara glanced at the disheveled woman begging in the lobby, her eyes showing a flicker of distant, fading recognition before settling into a cool, polite indifference. She didn't see a mother. She saw a stranger from a nightmare she had long since outgrown. She walked straight to Alessandro, tucking her arm into his. Are you ready to go, Dad? Simone said we're celebrating tonight. Alessandro finally looked at Isabella, his expression as unyielding as the stone beneath their feet. He didn't offer a lecture, an insult, or a single spark of the anger she had hoped for. My daughter already has a family, Isabella, and I already have a life. You're just a memory I stopped visiting 7 years ago. Without a backward glance, he turned toward the light, walking out of the building with Simone and Amara, leaving Isabella standing alone in the vast, empty silence of the empire she had once thrown away for a handful of silver.